panel will be moderated by Keith Masback, former DoD and IC senior executive and former USGIF CEO. I also want to let you know that the next session after this with Pascal Bornet, former head of AI automation and digital innovation at McKinsey, is canceled, as we received word a few minutes ago that he's currently in the emergency room with his son, who has had an accident. So this defense panel will be extended until 3:09 p.m. Joining us on the panel are Colonel Shane Taylor, Program Manager, Army Tactical Network at U.S. Army Acquisition Corps, Dan Madden, Director, Mid-Atlantic Region at National Security Innovation Network, U.S. Department of Defense, Abe Usher, co-CEO of Black Cape. Please help me welcome our panelists. I will let Keith take it from here.
I'm thrilled to be here. Appreciate the folks at Astor Perkins putting this together. JJ Snow from AFWorks called me earlier today. We had a great talk, and she would have been a fantastic panelist, but unfortunately was unable to join us. But I'm pretty thrilled with the panelists we have. I would tell you that when you take a look at our backgrounds, I think we've got three infantrymen and an artilleryman. So what that means is we're going to have to speak slowly and loudly during the course of the panel, but we'll get that on. We thought that something interesting worth sharing today would actually be this idea of everything that the Department of Defense and to a certain extent the intelligence community and DHS has been working on over the past few years to sort of open up what's traditionally been a pretty stodgy, pretty bureaucratic acquisition process. Colonel Taylor has plenty of expertise in having navigated that at various levels, and now he's taking advantage, I imagine, of these new opportunities. It's my observation, in fact, that it's created both simultaneously an opportunity and a challenge. That being, we understood, those of us that have worked in this world for some time, the federal acquisition regulations, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement, the FAR and DFARs. And now, so if you understood that process, if you understood how to navigate requirements through funding and into acquisition, that was sort of a certain level of organized chaos over time. And I think it's important to note that we shouldn't always lay everything on the FAR, because it's less about the words in that document than often how they're interpreted and how they've been used. And that, in fact, is the creating some of this new opportunity. So now, as visionary leaders, folks like Will Roper in the Air Force in particular, have looked at ways to hack the system a little bit, to move things along more quickly, to reach out to non-traditional folks from startups to larger companies who've just not traditionally engaged in business with the DoD. There's now this innovation opportunity, which in and of itself has become a bit of a bureaucracy. So when we were ramping up for the panel, I kind of set out a thing, and I think the first sort of topic I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on would be the simultaneous challenge and opportunity of these new innovative processes that sort of sit on top of, around, and are intertwined with the traditional acquisition processes, and how we can speak to an audience of investors and founders about how they can manage that. Perhaps it would be helpful, Colonel Taylor, if you want to take a shot at that first.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
All right, good. Hey, first of all, I really do appreciate this opportunity. So just my opinions as a PM, first I'll start with, I'm pretty far right in this process, right? From a technology maturity perspective. One of the things that's pretty interesting is that we're even having this conversation today, because a few years ago, this whole valley of death that we had between early technology and startups and accelerators and incubators And program managers on the very far right of this life cycle process, specifically within DoD, it's had its own name, right? We call it for years the Valley of Death. And so what you've seen over the last couple of years is really a shift. And you mentioned, Dr. Roper. I think he was one of the first ones. There are a few others. I think the Navy did a really good job a few years back as well, as we started bringing in folks that had done a lot of work on the SOCOM side, and and because of that, they were a lot more. When you look at from a scale perspective, it allows you to bring in all your requirements and your development folks and your resourcing folks and your user base all in the same room and are able to have a discussion. In the Army, we didn't do that. We had this very deliberate process that was really designed around building a tank. We were applying that tank building process to things like what I do with satellite ground stations and line of sight and ground line of sight capabilities, which from a technology standpoint, those things, the technology changes so fast, 5 to 7 year cycles just weren't working. And we were doing a poor job of keeping up with the technology and leveraging that technology. I think today, what you're seeing is we've kind of collapsed that. I've got the ability now that I can bring a vendor and the user together because we've stood up the AFC, and the network CFT has really kind of allowed us to bring everybody together. In the past, instead of a schoolhouse writing requirement over 2 years, throwing it over to the fence to me, I now have vendors able to come in, work with us, go down to Bragg, work with the soldiers, and we're actually able to have the technology drive the requirements as opposed to the requirements drive the technology. And so that opens up a lot more opportunity for, in the past, we were really vendor locked with kind of the 5 or 6 big defense businesses. We now have, I would argue that the bulk of my portfolio now is Big 5 because of the fact that we moved from development to mostly procuring and integrating COTS solutions. That comes with its own challenges. To your point, we've got a lot more flexible process now. I would argue 5000.2 and FAR and DFAR. Those were always excuses, in my opinion, to begin with. There are definitely ways to be rapid in our approaches, and I think a lot of those we tend to make excuses as opposed to use those as tools. But that being said, there is at least a culture now that is willing to accept failure from a rapid technology standpoint. That's probably what has changed the most, is that culture of bringing in technologies and rapidly integrating those and understanding they aren't all going to work. And let's get them in the hands of soldiers. Let's get the feedback from the soldiers, and then be willing to take a 90% COTS solution as opposed to a 100% developmental solution. That whole culture, I think, has changed, which is good for all of us. But what it has done is it's exposed us to a lot more non-traditional vendors and probably capabilities that are designed for a commercial market. And in a lot of these markets, we're a niche provider, a niche customer, and we're not used to that. We're used to being the big boys in the discussion and being able to drive the outcome. Now we might be 0.04% of somebody's market, and so we can't really drive what that market's going to do. So we have to be willing to take what they have and be able to rapidly integrate that into our formations. And so that's a new kind of dynamic for us that we have to work through, and that's that role as an integrator of COTS technology, as opposed to me just throwing money at a vendor and saying, hey, go build me something against the requirement. And then holding them accountable, across the process. So kind of balancing those two has probably been one of our, biggest challenges over the last couple of years. But I do want to leave it for others to answer as well. Over.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think your nod to Hondo Gertz, absolutely that was the right thing. The things that started down at SOCOM and then infiltrated up I-95 and into the Pentagon in that regard were super helpful. Next, I think what I'd like to hear a little bit from Abe Usher brings a perspective from having worked on the outside. And, again, although he has a military background, time at places like at Google and Human Geo and Radiant, and then being wrapped up into Digital Globe and Maxar, and ultimately now back out at Black Cape. Abe, I'd love to hear your perspective as you've watched this evolve from the outside, and what it's meant to you, both involved in startups, small businesses, and then even for your time at Google and DG Maxar in a really large business. Just some of the touch points and observations you've had.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. It's great to be here with you guys today. Also, I'm really happy that we got a Naval Academy grad online. Dan, I think you went to Annapolis. Army, for those who don't know, and I'm going to answer your questions 100%, Keith, but I have to gloat a little bit. Army is on a 3-year winning streak now against Navy, and having an Annapolis grad on the panel, I've got to rub it in a little bit because Navy had a 13-year streak winning against Army. So it's great to be here with you guys. As Keith shared, I was an Army officer in the 1990s at Fort Bragg. Had the privilege of serving as a paratrooper. It was frankly a little bit of a boring time. It was pre 9/11. I departed from there and I took a job with the government as a cryptologist at NSA. Following that, I was recruited into Google to work on Google Maps, and I was recruited out of Google by a Joint Special Operations Command intelligence leader. Some of you may know Al DiLeonardo. Worked with him a number of years, and then after he retired, ended up co-founding a company, Human Geo, which is short for Human Geography, which sought to combine a number of sensor data types with human geography and space-based intelligence to create breakthroughs in intelligence. Ultimately, that company merged with a larger entity called Radiant Group, where I was the CTO and helped grow their products in space-based modeling and simulation and geospatial signature analysis. I also had an executive role at DigiGlobe, where I was the VP of Machine Learning and Emerging Tech. So related to where we are today in terms of challenges and opportunities, I'm really excited, and I just want to double down on Colonel Taylor's comments that the Army and more broadly the DoD are experimenting with new ways to engage. For a number of years, I think everything was driven by large programs of record, which meant we had really slow, long cycle time and things happening. And so my experience both with Human Geo and Black Cape, I think it's great that there are organizations like AFWorks and SoftWorks who are providing additional places where small, innovative capability providers or startups can engage with the government. So that's a positive in that instead of having to navigate going through a Raytheon or a Lockheed Martin, there's direct connectivity to the government. I think a significant challenge that this poses, this is going to be an ongoing issue, is it does add another layer of bureaucracy and administration for innovative startups to try to figure out in the way that they engage with the government. And I think, no criticism, but just an observation, AFWorks has done a lot of positive outreach. Army Applications Lab, I think, has a really interesting process where companies with innovative capabilities can submit them to a capability catalog online. SOCOM and its partner, the Global SOF Foundation, also have a capabilities catalog where telecommunications and space capability providers can reach out directly. So I think this is good, but it does mean startups need to understand now they have multiple pathways that they need to explore to get engagement with the government. I've got additional comments on that, but I want to share the microphone with my other panelists also.
All right, Abe, thanks. I appreciate it. So we've gone from hardcore, super experienced acquisition professional. We moved into somebody who's got both small and large business experience from the outside coming in. And then Dan, I think you have a unique perspective, especially with respect to where you sit now. I think it'd be helpful up front, perhaps, if you talked a little bit about the National Security Innovation Network as a context for maybe addressing the question that we're noodling on right now.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the regional director for the Mid-Atlantic, really covering down on New York and New Jersey for something called the National Security Innovation Network, NSIN. It is a part of DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit. It falls under the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. It's the Department of Defense, the CTO. We've got the broad mission of building networks of innovators to solve national security challenges. My own background, served in the Marine Corps. You caught me. I did happen to graduate from the boat school. Glad to see it becoming a real game again. Served in the Marines as an artillery officer, worked on the Hill for a few years for a member of the Armed Services Committee who chaired oversight investigations, and then spent about 8 years at the RAND Corporation doing modernization studies for the Department of Defense, helping them figure out what they need next. During that time, I had the opportunity to act as something of a liaison to the Army G8. So I'd be one of these guys sitting down in program analysis and evaluation, building a POM, building a program of record. Those 5-year budgets that end up being the death knell of innovation in the near term. And also had the opportunity to spend about a year up in OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I'd end up, amongst other things, engaging with CAPE, the counterpart up there, cost assessment program evaluation, negotiating things like how much funding we're going to put against different priorities for my principal at the time. Anyway, so I've been doing this for Ensign now for about 2.5 years, and it's been really interesting for me to go from looking at sort of really high level, portfolio level things, have the opportunity to meet guys like Abe, and try to support guys like Colonel Taylor, and help sort of build bridges between the two. For me, I guess I do want to say a few things about just, I've not been the entrepreneur, I've not been the man in the arena, right? But I end up sitting ringside a lot, and I hear a lot of stories from a lot of different entrepreneurs. So I'm going to give you like the 2-minute version, I guess, of the distilled wisdom of what I've been seeing. And I can't wait for Abe to tell me why I'm wrong, or for Shane. It'll be good.
It's coming.
All right. So I guess like thing one, if you're a startup and you're looking at the Department of Defense as a potential market, like thing one is, figure out how well aligned that is with your underlying thesis, right? So if you're fundamentally going to be a defense company and that's what you want to be when you grow up, then that's not a hard question. If actually you're thinking about the sort of dual use play, where you're going to be pursuing both the commercial and defense market, then you have much deeper, much tougher thinking ahead of you. If you are a B2C, if you're a business selling directly to consumers, doing business with the Department of Defense is probably not going to be a great fit. It's going to be hard. You're going to have to build really unique sort of BD infrastructure and business processes to support that. If your commercial vision is going to entail selling to big corporate giants anyway, like banks and these kinds of things, then actually like you're already going to be pretty comfortable with the kind of business cycle, the kind of sales cycle that you're going to experience with the Department of Defense. Whether you're talking about like a major university or a huge bank, scale, it's hard to sell into really large organizations, and that's just going to take some time. Now, obviously, as we've been discussing, the Department of Defense has been doing some things to lower those barriers to entry. I think, obviously what Dr. Roper's been doing with AppWorks and the Small Business Innovation Research Awards has done a tremendous amount to create buzz and interest and engagement in the tech community. That is a great point of entry, but I would barely treat a phase one as evidence of traction. Obviously, a lot of work has been done to overcome this valley of death between the people and organizations and the funding available for research and development, and the people and funding and organizations that are engaged in procurement, but it's not gone. And so as you get that sort of initial taste through the SBIR program, you really need to be thinking about your end game of like, who are the customers that are going to be within the Department of Defense that are going to be my early adopters? And who are the customers that I'm going to be able to scale with them longer term? And for any one of those, you're going to want to mass fires. You're going to want to have multiple points of entry. You're going to want to create multiple points of contact, multiple ways of engagement. There's a lot of different mechanisms out there available to help with that. My organization, Ensign, can help with that to some extent. But at the Air Force, they have a lot of mechanisms in place to help with that as well, like their colliders, some of those kinds of things. The traditional industry days are still a thing. Directly engaging with the program managers, folks like Colonel Shane Taylor, and starting to educate them early on before the solicitation comes out about where you see the technology headed and where you see the capability opportunities. And so that's a lot. I guess one other thing to point out is the consortia out there, the OTA consortia. in general, I hear sort of mixed things, but as a general matter, it seems the barrier to entry there is pretty low, and the cost of entry is pretty low. So it's worth Googling the OTA consortium that's aligned with the work that you're doing and where you're trying to pursue. Signing up for it might cost $500. It's cheaper than a business development airfare. So I just said a lot. I'll go ahead and step back now.
Colonel Taylor, Shane, and Abe, I know you're chomping at the bit, but I think it's important to lay out and not leave some of the folks in our audience behind. Could you, Colonel Taylor, talk a little bit? You talked about AFC and CFTs, and those of us who are fortunate to wander around in this muck all the time. We speak the language. Maybe articulate a little bit about what that setup is, and the idea behind taking advantage of Army Futures Command and establishing it down in Austin, and what the CFTs do and how they feed in. For those who aren't necessarily familiar, let's help them decode that language a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. No. Absolutely. No problem. So we love our acronyms, and not only do we love it within the Army, but within the Acquisition Corps, we like to make up ones too. So fair comment. The one thing I will before we jump into that, and I will go there, I do want to mention a little bit about what was talked about just a second ago from an innovation standpoint, and it's something to keep an eye on. If you're on that innovation side, that I've struggled with this last probably 12 to 18 months, is we actually have gone after some relatively new innovative solutions from a capabilities perspective, partnered with some smaller businesses. What we have run into, and it's happened multiple times to me already, is we'll pilot a solution and it'll do great at what it's designed to do for one or two mission sets. As we get to and scale is always an issue with the Army. We challenge we've had trouble in the past where we've taken technologies that we've pulled out of USGIF or SOCOM or others, and while it works for small teams of highly trained individuals, it doesn't necessarily scale to large conventional forces who don't have that level of training. And that's from a capabilities perspective and a system perspective. But from a new innovation perspective, a lot of the vendors that I've worked with, as they went from design of a pilot and they had to scale that to a production facility to a vendor, we have struggled. They continuously had challenges scaling up at the numbers that we needed and maintaining quality. So I will put that out there as something for folks to keep in mind. So from an AFC network CFT perspective, what happened a few years ago within the Army is, I said previously, requirements were generated in the different schoolhouses. We have schoolhouses based off of function. We have an infantry school, we have a aviation school, we have an armor school, etc. Me as an C4 ISR kind of guy, I get requirements from all those different organizations. And what had happened in the past is Benning would tell me one thing and Huachuca would tell me another. And as the PM, I was kind of put in a position where I had to kind of deconflict the different requirements that the forces were being asked to were asking for. And so that created, really, you don't want the material developer having to be the guy that makes the operational decisions. And so what the Army did was they stood up, and this was to get after several issues, but from a PM perspective, this is what it did for me. They stood up an organization called AFC. They put a 4-star general in charge of it, who actually came out of who was the absolute right person for it, came out of the G8, understood the business side of this, understood the services side of this from a user perspective, as a warfighter, and so put him in charge of this organization that's now in charge of setting the prioritization for the innovation and the material path forward for the Army, the modernization path forward for the Army, and that became really critical because now it took guys like me out of a position where I had to make operational decisions and I can turn to my counterpart over the network CFT and say, all right, here's the issue. I have enough resources, because we never have enough resources. I know everybody thinks we throw a lot of resourcing into some of these efforts. You never have enough. And so now I can say, all right, team, here's all the requirements that are being levied against me. Here's the amount of resources that we have. And where Dan came from, they never gave us enough resources, right? Those darn P&E guys never funded us like we needed to. So we can turn to them and say, all right, based off of that, what's the OML or the order of merit list, and how do we want to resource this, and how do we want to apply that? And so it's made, quite honestly, it's made my life 10 times easier, so I can focus my team on the true operational requirements. The other thing it's done is they've set up things like the Capital Factory and some of those kind of efforts that has provided an entry gate for like the folks that are on this call. And so they've stood up a facility outside the gate here at APG in Maryland, where they work with some of because this has kind of become the home of C5ISR for the Army, although I'm calling you from my house because we can't use Zoom on base. So which I always find ironic, so because of that, AFC is also kind of taken that role to bridge that valley of death that we talked about. So they also own the S&T side of the house and the lab side of the house. And so they have now taken it to where somebody else previously owned the lab, we own the material solution. They now can help shape and make sure that what the S&T folks are chasing fills the gaps that we're trying to meet. And because in the past, those weren't always aligned. Quite frankly, in my opinion, there was a lot of pet projects over here. And we were chasing what we thought were KPPs or requirements, coming out of the schoolhouses. They have now they kind of control both of us, even though I work for the Secretariat, but they still kind of help prioritize me and align me with what the S&T folks are doing. And so there's now a clear expectation of, us signing transition agreements, putting program plans together and resourcing against it, where in the past, a lot of that was really more of a hand wave than an execution. So that was a lot. I'll pause for any questions or comments. Over.
Shane, I appreciate it. That was especially helpful in juxtaposing sort of the way it was and the way it is, what the rationale was. And I think it's we're all probably in violent agreement that things are certainly better. And we probably also in violent agreement there's plenty of more stuff to fix.
Oh, absolutely.
But we're certainly better than where we were.
Can I ask a question, maybe make one comment?
Yeah, I think you're just trying to delay Abe coming back at you, but go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. So one's a sort of a side comment. I feel like in this story about the Army's R&D community somehow not being focused on the Army's priorities or not being well aligned prior to AFC. There's a character of sort of a just so story to it, right? When you look at some of the trouble that I think the creation of the Army Futures Command was created in response to, a lot of it came down to some instability in those underlying requirements that you as a program manager had to respond to, right? It wasn't that, I think the acquisition community as a whole, and I think the R&D community in particular, got a short shrift. And, when the Chief of Staff of the Army's top priority ends up going from, we're going to be able to move in like an entire armor brigade from continental United States to the Middle East inside of 30 days. So we need, thin armor and high mobility, to we need to be able to fight a counterinsurgency, to we need to be able to fight a pure competitor. There's a lot of whiplash on the requirement side hitting you guys. And so I think there's an element to that story that's been unfair to the acquisition community and the R&D community. A sort of more specific thing, you mentioned this, and this is something that sort of touched me closely as I try to help and mentor some of these startups they're trying to figure out how to scale for the Department of Defense. You mentioned the challenge, and I've heard similar things. In terms of that challenge of transitioning from the early pilots, the early prototyping, into like actually producing at scale. What kind of strategies have you employed to try to mitigate that? One thing that I've been looking at starting to experiment with in the coming years, the Mentor Protege program. So we'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think, and I agree with your comment on the S&T side. So from a Look, I never took the whole acquisition. I mean, I'll be quite frank, right? So acquisition sucks was all I heard for a couple of years. I never took that personal. I know the difference between big A and little a and what the challenges were from an Army perspective. I really focused it more of, I mean, look, I work on networks, right? And I'm not allowed to say WinT anymore, right? But from a particular perspective, that system was designed for, FOB-based warfare, not for a near-peer engagement, right? So that's to your point, that's what the Army wanted at the time. We don't want that anymore, so we pivot. So we have to have a process that allows us to do that pivot, because you're absolutely right. Tomorrow I'm going to be told I needed to focus on something else, and so I've had to have that flexibility. Those 5 to 7 year development, prime vendor lock kind of contracts don't give you that flexibility. So all the above fair. From a going from pilot to scale, I mean, first of all, I wish I did know the answer to that. Unfortunately, what I've seen from both of the vendors that I had last year that had that issue, and this is probably not what you want to hear, they end up having to partner with another organization that was more about producing repetitive production at scale. And so, whether it's somebody that's already in the field, one of the current vendors, or, whether it's just one of these firms that is we know how to produce at scale kind of companies, they ended up having to do that to meet mission. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad. I don't know enough about that side. My guess is, it was probably profitable for them, but I don't know if that's, I also understand that if it's your baby and you're having to sell it, I don't know if that's a good thing either. Again, not familiar with that side of the fence. To make mission, to meet contractual requirements, they were kind of forced into, some of those kind of situations. But I mean, I would hope that in the future, to your point, if there's a better way to do it, so that. But now, I mean, one of them was like, hey, I created this idea. I got it across the fence. I sold it to somebody else to produce. Now I'm on to my next thing, because I really don't want to produce stuff. I mean, I don't want to manufacture stuff. I want to create. For him, it wasn't as, that organization, it wasn't as big a deal, but I don't know if that's the common opinion. I know some people, I've got folks in the lab, engineers, they do not want to be upstairs with me in the PM shop. They want to be in the lab. Conversely, I've got folks the other way around. So, everybody's, kind of good at different things. But I know that's probably not the best answer, but that's what I saw the last 24 months, probably with some of those startups that we were working with, unfortunately.
Thanks. Hey, Abe, here's your shot, brother.
Great. Thanks, Keith. I think a lot of insightful comments by Colonel Taylor about how the Army has evolved to support innovation. And, I'm excited to hear how the cross-functional teams are simplifying some of the requirements process. I think that's very promising. When I was in the Army in the 90s, I would say a lot of people had the attitude of, well, if it was good enough in 1775 for the Continental Army and George Washington, it's good enough for us. And so, I think we want to be respectful of our institutions and history, but also embrace change. As much as I would like to disagree with a Naval Academy grad and Marine, Dan, I think you've got it right. As you're describing sort of organizations understanding their own DNA and where they go, I think that's really a critical thing that people sometimes overlook. I've got a really simple formula in trying to figure out how to be a good industry partner and how to grow with the Department of Defense and providing capabilities that are relevant. I'll sum it up in 3 words: the domain, the data, and the destination. And to add a little bit of detail to that, if you're going to be a company that is principally focused on national security, you've got to understand the domain. And you're not going to get that just by playing Call of Duty Black Ops or binge watching Netflix, but you really need to participate as an industry partner. And a number of ways you do that. I think Dan's discussion about capabilities of the National Security Innovation Network, he probably has a lot of ideas there. I would just, in addition, throw out participating in industry groups like the US Geospatial Intelligence Foundation, the Global Special Operations Forces Global Soft Foundation, as well as going after places to engage with cooperative research and development agreements, where at no cost to the government, you work on a shared problem, introduce them to your technology and show them there's a new way of solving something. And then small business and innovative research grants in a sort of low capital way. You let the government understand your technology and adapt it to a government requirement. So that's know the domain. The second area is you need to understand how your capabilities fit into the data and communications infrastructure of the DoD. And then the third is the destination. So as you understand where technology is headed and where a DoD organization's mission is, combine those two things and help co-author a good destination of where technology can get the military. Keith, back to you.
All right, I appreciate that. Abe, I had written down one of the things that I wanted to share was, I think, the value of the organization, some of the ones you mentioned. I find myself in my current incarnation professionally, people ask me what I do with a portfolio of startups that I advise, that I invest in, consult for. And what I feel like I am is a Sherpa, right? I'm a Sherpa that helps them understand and navigate all of this stuff. And one of the things that I think is certainly sort of a hack, if you will, is to get involved in these organizations. And you mentioned some of them. Obviously, I led the United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation for a decade, so that one's pretty near and dear to my heart. I helped Stu and those guys stand up the Global Soft Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar, while these are set up as 501c3 educational, nonprofit, non-lobbying organizations, they are de facto, not for the purpose of the IRS, but they are de facto and on occasion walk and quack like a trade association. And there is value there, and they are focused in no small measure on the needs of small businesses. And I think that they try and keep the barrier to entry low for small businesses joining and becoming part of them. And as I advise my startups, it's not about writing a check. I appreciated the checks when I led one of these organizations. We had 250 members from Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman all the way down to sole proprietors of small startups. But I said the checks are interesting and the checks are helpful and they keep the lights on and pay the staff. But what really made those organizations special was when people got engaged. I think that's the opportunity for a startup. And I know time is money and people are precious in a startup mode. But there is a marginal advantage that you can gain by taking advantage. So I'd list Global Soft, Small Satellite Association, USGIF, AFCEA, INSA, NDIA, and others. So there's a number of them. You'd have to sort of pick your poison as a startup or as a non-traditional.
There's actually sort of a complementary species where the Department of Defense has sort of set up almost similar kinds of organizations. These things called partnership intermediary agreements. And I think at this point, most of the DoD labs, I'm less certain about the program offices, have these things. The NSA has a PIA, partnership intermediary agreement, with an organization in Maryland called Dreamport. So I think the intent there is to serve a similar function. In some ways, it kind of runs with the roles of the OTA consortiums, but it's a little bit more open than those even, I think. I work very closely with the Air Force Research Lab up in Rome, New York, the Information Directorate. Those guys, they have the Griffiths Institute, and increasingly, really, they're using this sort of coalition of local stakeholders that go under the brand of the Innovari Institute for running a lot of their innovation efforts focused on, boring things like cyber, AI, ML, all the good stuff. I guess just I also want to provide like a little bit of an anecdote of the kind of role that I and Ensign have tried to play in helping folks like Abe leverage those kinds of mechanisms I was talking about. So last year I had somebody from who was sort of dual-hatted Army Cyber Institute and Cyber National Mission Force come to me and tell me, hey, look, I've got this sort of contrarian thesis, right? Like I actually within the cyber community, it's very sort of operationally tactically focused in many ways. Setting aside like the exceptional leadership that Cybercom has right now, which I think actually all this can be recognized. But that's sort of the institutional culture. You've got a bunch of codecs there, right? Anyway, you want to be able to step back and do sort of a net assessment of what's going on in the information environment, really concerned about countering disinformation, going into the election cycle. And so we set up but he didn't have any money yet. It was just kind of getting spun up, just building credibility. He had a contrarian thesis, so there wasn't a pot of money there. This thing wasn't palmed. It wasn't a program of record. It wasn't a long-term budget for it. So what we did was we did some initial outreach. Actually, we ended up partnering with the State Department's Global Engagement Center. They put aside a little pot of money, like $15K for three pots of $15K for 3 different companies. Did initial outreach and down select to like our national network of universities, accelerator programs, incubators, the usual suspects. And we ended up finding some great companies that were doing really cool stuff. Think folks like Umlas, Peak Metrics, NewsGuard, and those guys are like directly supporting like current ops already for Cybercom. One of them already won a phase 2, starting the MOUs that were sort of follow-on from the initial pilot efforts with Cybercom. So there's a lot of folks out there. There's a lot of Sherpas out there like Keith that are excited about helping you find a way to have an impact on the Department of Defense and our national security. And we're all excited to be a part of your journey.
I appreciate you weighing in on that, Dan, and that's important. And the PIAs are certainly sort of emergent, right? People are trying to figure out their way through them. The agencies aren't sure-footed about what they mean. The lawyers are still working on it, but it's pretty clear there's a lot of opportunity there. Abe, you mentioned CRADAs. I guess a quick pitch I'd make for CRADAs is in some places they become sort of a 4-letter word, that Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, because what boards hear, right, what investors hear when they hear a founder say CRADA is they hear no money. And I'll tell you that I have watched the entire range of people engaged in CRADAs. I have watched large companies give quite a bit of IP to the government and get almost nothing in return. More often, I've seen large companies get a tremendous amount of data and information from the government, and the government do a poor job of getting anything in return, except ultimately later buying things that were built off that back. And so I do think there's opportunity for startups with respect to CRADAs. I do think that the ability to protect their IP and have a protected legal discourse exchange with the government on a different level than a pitch, really gives them a tremendous opportunity for a marginal advantage over their competitors and a way to sort of leap forward a little bit. And it's certainly one of the frustrations I see in working with my startups with which I'm engaged is the amount of pressure that I see investors putting on founders. The founders talking about quarterly meetings and quarterly returns. When they're maybe just coming up on an A round or on the other side of an A round, and you go, they're not traded on the stock exchange. I don't understand why you're putting all this pressure on these guys when they really need to be executing. But I'll get off my soapbox for a second here. We've got just a few minutes left, so I'd like to kind of go a speed round, starting with you, Shane. Just some observations to kind of bring things to a close here for this panel.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I'll circle back on the credit comment too. I think from our perspective, we're seeing a lot more. I agree with you. A few years ago, I would have probably used it as definitely as a 4-letter word. I will say, because what we're seeing as far as a better alignment between the developmental, S&T side of the base and the execution on the material solution side, because of that better alignment, I think we are seeing better progress from a creative perspective. Holistically, obviously there are exceptions to the rule. The advantage that I see with that is it does allow we struggle right now from a network strategy, back to the comments earlier about every few years we kind of change our focus. Well, that really makes it hard on industry to know where to put their IRAD and where to put their investments. And from a creative perspective, because it's jointly done, it gives that vendor kind of an opportunity to keep up with us as we continuously change our focus. And it gives them we've never done the best job of saying, hey, this is our, to every business developer's nightmare. We've never been able to really clearly articulate, hey, in 5 years, this is where I want to be, right? Because from a technology perspective, industry is much better at forecasting than we are. But I think that CRADA kind of bridges that gap a little bit. But from a holistic perspective, I just think that we are in, kind of go back to my opening comments. I do think we're in a much better position today for the folks that are on this call than we used to be from doing business with the DoD. I truly feel that, and that is because of the fact that we've really pivoted towards, at least on the Army networking side, and I think you could say the same about a lot of the acquisition. We've really pivoted towards more leaning on commercial capabilities and cost items that enable, that we can can leverage and incorporate into our existing baselines, and so that opens it up for a lot more folks. And quite honestly, we're learning more on how to set conditions to bring in those non-traditional vendors, right? We're still, we got a long ways to go, but we are setting up, opportunities. I mean, from a small business perspective, one of the biggest challenges that I saw initially was, we have these crazy cost accounting systems that we ask small businesses to be able to meet. And so I think we're getting better at kind of bridging some of those gaps, creating opportunities where we can meet with, we can partner small business right with the user, like what I was talking about earlier, where we go out and we call them soldier touch points, and we'll bring capabilities in, go down to Bragg. And I pick on Bragg because they're the closest to us here at APG. So we use the 82nd for a lot. And so that allows us to get feedback directly from the soldiers, because in case, and you guys know this, but I don't know if all vendors do, you can design a system to do a particular thing. I guarantee you a soldier's going to do something different with that system. So we do like to get the kit in their hands, see how they use it, see what their feedback is, because they will do things with it that we never thought of. And so that's valuable feedback, quite honestly. And so, like I said, it's an exciting time, I think, because of the opportunities that are out there. The culture has changed. We now have a culture that allows innovation and an acceptance of failure, which in the past would have been the death knell to any program. The PA&Es of the world would have been looking for us if we started slipping schedules, or breaching any of our baselines. I think that culture is changed a little bit because of some of the leadership that we have now at the senior levels of the Army, and I think that's a great thing. So the environment is where it needs to be, I think, to support a lot of the things that we're talking about on this call.
All right, Shane, thanks so much. Dan, Abe, we got 30 seconds apiece. So,
hey, Abe, I'll jump in. Just Colonel Taylor, appreciate your service and technology leadership in the Army, and to the other participants, Dan and Keith, also appreciate your service in many capacities. I challenge the participants. Innovation is a team sport, so reach out and keep the conversation going beyond the event.
All right, Dan.
What Abe said. No, hey, Keith, thanks a lot for having us. I really enjoyed the conversation. Abe and Shane, really enjoyed having an opportunity to chat with you guys. And like Abe said, for the rest of the audience, if you're interested in having a conversation about how to get more deeply engaged in defense innovation, let me know.
And finally, thank you to all the panelists. Thanks to Astor Perkins, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, and all of our panel of experts.